All right. All right, we'll get started. Thanks, everybody. My name is Michael Potter. I'm the founder of Find My Zen. We are a free platform that is all about connecting people to the things that they're searching for, specifically in the wellness, as well as a little bit more philanthropy and environmental. Anything that inspires curiosity and awe is what we're really about. We are in 12 cities now. Before COVID hit, we were aggregating about 7,000 wellness events. So we really want to be a source that you can quickly discover things that might get you interested in a whole different modality practice, or even something like space. So I know some of you here today are avid space terranauts or explorers, whether you are working with companies that are in the space business, or just a curious seeker. But we also have a number of people that are kind of coming into this from a very different lens and thread of more getting curious about ourselves and really what is it we're doing here, especially with all the shifts that are going on in today's society. How can we start recognizing our more interconnectedness? How can we have more inclusivity? How can we have more of that cohesive and coherence that actually binds us and allows us to function in a way so we're not just in it alone, going through our own journey. I'm very excited about our two conversational participants. We have Frank White, who's the author of The Overview Effect, and we also have Rachel Lyons, who's the executive director of Space for Humanity. Frank, I'd love to have you introduce yourself a little bit and just, yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, well, it's great to be here. Thank you, Michael. Really looking forward to talking with everybody. There's a few people here that I already know. They've already heard my story. If you'll bear with me, I'm just going to repeat it quickly for people who don't know the background. But I'm the author of a book called The Overview Effect, Space Exploration and Evolution. And the way it came about was that I was at the time in the late 70s or early 80s fascinated by inner space and outer space. I was meditating. I was very interested in Zen Buddhism. And I was also quite interested in the Space Studies Institute founded by Gerard K. O'Neill. I was flying cross country and looking out the window for several hours. And all I can call it is an epiphany, a sense of understanding something. And what I understood was that if I lived in outer space, in a space settlement or space community, I would always have an overview of the Earth. And I came up with the term overview effect, and I related it to spiritual traditions like Zen and other philosophical traditions that, without thinking about it, understand the interconnectedness of all life on Earth. And as soon as we landed, I started interviewing astronauts because there were no space communities then. And I found out that unlike what I had expected, which was that the overview effect would be ordinary, you'd see the Earth in the sky, you would know all of these things about it. For people brought up on the surface, it was extraordinary, it was mind-blowing, it was worldview shifting, etc. And since that time, I've been expanding on the idea and thinking about how do we bring the overview effect down to Earth? And I'm really gratified to say, and Rachel certainly will tell you more about this, there is really a worldwide movement to bring this experience that the astronauts have down to Earth, because what we want to do is see a shift in cognition on a social level, on a planetary level, that we can detect in the astronauts on an individual level. We can get more deeply into that as we go along, but I'd say in the last chapter of the book, I had the notion of a human space program, which would be a transnational central project for all of humanity that would be involved in exploring the universe. And not only exploring outer space, but by doing so, exploring our inner life. And we can talk more, as I said, about what a central project is. But that's the short version of a kind of uh, a long journey, Michael.
Thank you. And I do want to mention, we will actually send out, there is the video overview effect that we will send out in a follow-up email along with some other assets. And anything that gets discussed today, we will be sending out in an email. So definitely recommend the book. If you haven't read it, it's really blown my world open in a way that I feel it's shifted my perspective just by reading the book and engaging in a different way of thinking. So very grateful to have you on today. And Rachel Lyons, welcome.
Thanks, Michael. Um, yeah, so I have a somewhat similar story to Frank, which I think the people that I know on this call also have ones like this, where it's like a single moment that just shifted their perspective forever. And for Frank, it was looking out the window out at the horizon of an airplane. And for me, it was watching the first episode of Neil deGrasse Tyson's Cosmos. So this documentary series, in the first episode, he starts at Earth, and then he expands outward to the solar system and outward to the galaxy and outward and outward and outward. And I went from just having my own reality of me and my life and my community and the town that I lived in and all of that, to seeing that we actually live in a seemingly infinite universe. And it was like truly a spiritual experience. Like, it was paradigm shifting. And my life was never the same after that. And my, like, just the way I viewed my place on this planet became new, and the way I viewed my relationship to other people became new. And like, I suddenly had this gratitude for existence. And I wondered, what would it be like on this planet if everyone had that perspective? And I was a college student at the time, so I went into aerospace engineering because I was like, I want us to become a spacefaring species, and I want to help make it happen. I want to build those rockets. And then I was lucky enough to meet Frank at a conference 3 months later. And he went up there and he showed the first 2 minutes of the overview film that Michael mentioned, this incredible film. And then he talked about this thing called the overview effect. And he's interviewed I think it's more than 50 astronauts now, Frank, right?
41.
41. Okay, I'm a little off. 41.
We're aiming for 50. We'll get there.
He'll get there for sure. And just all of them have, and there's been scientific studies as well about this cognitive shift, and researchers who study spiritual experiences, and also researchers that study like cognitive behavior, and then everything in between there. And it's interesting how whoever's studying it, the way that they classify them. But I mean, from my personal experience, I would say that it's a spiritual experience for sure. And I think Frank can go more into that. And and learning about the overview effect, just I realized that was what happened to me. And this experience actually has the power to really change the world in a way. And then I met the founder of Space for Humanity at a conference a few years later. And the mission of Space for Humanity is to sponsor regular people from all over the world to go to space, flying there commercially, so that they can go and have this experience of the overview effect, and then come back down and share that experience in their communities and beyond. And the technology is almost there. Like, this is actually going to be happening really, really soon. And so it's our opportunity to use this technology for good, to use this technology consciously, because so much of the technology that we build isn't used in thoughtful ways. And so that's why I'm doing what I'm doing with Space for Humanity, because I know personally the impact that it can have on the world.
Thank you for that, Rachel. As an entrepreneur myself, I know how meaningful it is not just to have the grandiose ideas and vision of how we want to build something and how that, can be a structure that we live in our brain, how do we actually also have the compassion and the heart that goes along with it, and really look at things in a way that I think can meaningfully empower that conversation to ripple out then. And so it's not just the business that you're creating, but it's the energy that you're putting into it, and the love and the curiosity, my favorite word, curiosity right now, that really applies to this conversation. So yeah, I'd love to just kind of unpack a little bit of what that perspective shift is that astronauts have, and really how does that earth gazing opportunity that they get to experience, how can we actually start to be a little bit more empowered here on earth? Because yes, I'm loving that just as a technology has a hockey stick hyperbola of just where it starts to really start to take off. I see that just beginning right now. So this is such a great time for us all to get curious and be a part of this conversation. But I also just love the idea of how do we actually be terranauts and just get that kind of perspective here on Earth. So Frank, I'd love to get your insights and just actually explain a little bit more what a terranaut is.
Yeah, well, a terranaut is a term I came up with in writing the book, and it's a person who has astronaut awareness without actually having gone into orbit or to the moon. It's a recognition that we are on a spaceship called Earth. And what you might say is that the terranauts are the astronauts of spaceship Earth. One of the metaphors astronauts use a lot is to point out to us that we are in space. This dichotomy between Earth and space is false. We cannot be anywhere but in space, and we will always be in space. So the idea of going into space is a misnomer. What the astronauts do is they leave the planet. Quite a different thing if you think about it, because we're already in space. So the terranaut is a person who, by whatever means, recognizes this and feels it. And Michael, it's really hard to do because your experience right now of where you are in the universe is exactly the same as your ancestors 35,000 years ago. You and I are experiencing Earth as a stable platform, and the heavens are rotating above us. So it's very hard to get that awareness. And what's unique when you leave the Earth is you experience the reality of us living on this spaceship. So one of the astronauts I talked to, Sandy Magnus, when I said, "What did you get out of being an astronaut?" She said, "It's the difference between intellectual knowledge and experiential knowledge. We all know we live on a planet revolving around the sun, but we don't really know it in our bodies and in our hearts. Uh, so a terranaut has a very difficult challenge because we're defining it as not having gone into orbit, not having the direct experience, but perhaps through something like what Rachel was describing, or something I experienced, or through a virtual reality rendition, the person has shifted in some way. And, one thing I've said before, and I'll just say it again, I believe experiencing the overview effect should be a human right. I want everybody to become a terranaut. And the reason it should be a human right is it's the truth. It's a true perception of who we are and where we are in the universe. Without it, we are just fumbling around with, it's like, you're driving your car down the road backwards, and you're trying to steer by looking into the rear view mirror. You're not really seeing reality the way it is. And so I think Rachel and I and many of our colleagues believe that if more people could have this shift, then so would the world. So would the human system we call humanity would have that shift.
Mm, yeah. And Rachel, I know you're also familiar with some of the things. I know Frank just mentioned VR. Um, Tell us a little bit about what you've seen just going on in the actual on Earth kind of communities that are empowering us to somatically have these experiences.
Yeah, sure. Um, there's so many, so many. And like Frank said, it really is becoming a movement. I actually, a talk that I gave in November, I like spent the first 2/3 of it just talking about how this truly is a movement. Like there's music artists who are committed to bringing the overview effect to their audiences. And like this group, one of my most favorite groups called Mardeleva. They're from Tulum, and they have the most awe-inspiring shows. And it's because actually of the overview effect in the studies that were done out of the University of Pennsylvania. They saw that the largest emotion that was elicited in the astronauts is that feeling of awe, and underneath that is wonder. And so it's like and awe is interesting because it expands your view. It makes your world bigger because it makes you feel like you're part of something greater than yourself. And so any well done art can bring that to people. And so Mardeleva being the perfect example. And then yeah, there's Space VR who's doing you do a VR headset, a flotation tank. And then what else is there? Mary Liz Bender, who's on here, she's working on some things with the cosmic perspective. That that brings the overview effect down to earth. I mean, you can get it watching a rocket launch. Like I never thought that that would impact me the way that it did, but I watched a rocket launch and I was like, that thing is going to space. We're sending that to space. Like, that's paradigm shifting in itself. Just thinking like we are literally sending things to space right now. Like we are sending things off this planet. So yeah, there's a lot of different things, and maybe that's a follow-up, Michael. Maybe I'll send you a list for you to send in the follow-up email with all of my recommendations for the overview effects works of art that bring it down to earth.
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate that you opened up that it doesn't actually need to be another thing that we need to go do, meaning like another VR or float take. I mean, of course, as a wellness enthusiast, I love all those things and how technology and other things, external things, can help our bodies actually feel the actual emotion and resonance of this kind of concept. But there's even, last week there was a call that I was on that talked about a new website app called Skyfy, and this theory of look up and just actually starting to really just stop what you're doing, look up at the sky, and maybe have a conversation with the person next to you about what you're thinking about, and using just that perspective change. And really what we're talking about is just a shift of perspective, and that to me is just such a meaningful component that we can have at any time, any day, any moment. And so it's just such a complement to meditation, complement to breath work, and so many of the practices that Find My Zen helps people discover. This really gives a kind of a glue that can bind that together in a really beautiful way. Frank, I'm actually curious because I know in your book you also kind of talk about the spiritual experience that the astronauts go through, and just also with your exploration of Buddhism, Zen, Taoism. Let's open that up a little bit.
You know, Michael, almost everyone I talk to wants to know if it's a spiritual experience, the overview effect. And, I think it has a lot to do with definition. How do you define spirituality? And also, I think we have to separate spiritual from religious in defining this, because early on there was this idea out there that every astronaut had a religious experience. And I interviewed Don Lynn, who happens to be a Mormon, and he said he had talked to everybody who went on the Apollo missions, and he believed that if people were religious before they went, they had a religious experience, but not if they weren't religious. And so that's the religion part. The spiritual side is a little more, I think, nuanced. And I think that the way in which it is a spiritual experience is that almost every spiritual discipline, and indeed almost every religious discipline I know about, opens you up to something larger than yourself. And I think Rachel mentioned that. You get a sense of, oh, I'm part of something greater than myself. You might call it God, you might call it Allah, you might call it the universe, you might call it cosma, et cetera, but clearly the astronauts, when they see the Earth from a distance, realize that we humans are part of something larger than ourselves, and at minimum, it's the Earth, and that we're part of some interconnected being, you might say. One of the things we often miss is the astronauts not only see the Earth from a distance in a new way, they see the universe in a new way that no other human has ever seen it. And so that also brings out this sense of awe and wonder, which of course is part of spirituality. If I could just expand a little bit, I'll just say a couple of more things. When I interviewed Edgar Mitchell, who founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is working on a virtual reality reproduction of his experience, incidentally, he said, Frank, what have you learned? Because I'd interviewed a few astronauts already. He said, what have you learned? And I said, well, Edgar, I thought everybody would have the same experience, but they all had different experiences. And he said, well, I would challenge you on that. I believe the experience was the same, but the way it's interpreted, the way it's described, is dependent upon the individual. And so that's why you get this variation, and you don't have everybody saying, oh, yes, it was spiritual. But again, if you look beneath the surface of what everybody is saying, you do get this shift in awareness, shift in worldview, and a sense of being part of something larger than the individual. And the other thing I would say is that when I had the insight that led to working on the overview effect, I personally immediately related it to spirituality. And if you read the book, I related it to Zen and to enlightenment. That was how I felt it was going to turn out. And one final point about Edgar, if you read about his interpretation of his experience, he had a sense of oneness with the entire cosmos. I mean, it really is powerful. And it is often seen as the definition of the overview effect. When he came back, and he talks about this in the overview film, he went around asking people, what happened? What was that? I don't know what happened to me out there. And finally, somebody said, well, you experienced samadhi. And what's interesting is Edgar was very open with me. He's not comfortable with the term spiritual. He was very comfortable with consciousness, expanding consciousness, and so on. But a third party who had some grounding in religious and spiritual traditions felt that he had experienced enlightenment, essentially. So ultimately, if you define it properly, I would say the overview effect is a spiritual experience. However, many astronauts would not be comfortable calling it that. So, we have to be very careful and nuanced in the way that we talk about it.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that back to the word Zen. And obviously, I'm a big advocate for anybody who's searching for their Zen. And Rachel, also curious, just your thoughts on this.
Thank you. Yeah, so just this is actually something that Frank shared with me, and it's stuck with me ever since. Is that yeah, he speaks to something like, of the less than 600 people who have been to space, it's been almost entirely scientists and engineers, a lot of people trained in the military. So like spirituality for a lot of them simply isn't part of their background, which is why we need to be thoughtful about the way it's defined, that this experience is defined. Yeah, the thing that stuck with me that Frank shared, though, like probably a couple of years ago at this point, is that one of the biggest differences between astronauts having an oh wow, like paradigm shifting experience and just I don't know, doing their job is the personality trait of openness. So the more open a person is, the more likely they are to have something that's truly paradigm shifting.
Mm.
And I think that's also like, this is another thing that can be cultivated on earth. Like we can all work on having more and more of an open mind. We can all try and bring awe into our daily lives. And then one other thing about awe is that it's linked to greater life satisfaction and pro-social behavior. So like there are literally links towards people who experience more awe and essentially having more love in the world. you know
Yeah.
and so that's something that we can all do right now.
Yeah. If I could build on that, Michael, what Rachel's saying, I think if there's anything central to Zen that is practical, and it is a very practical practice, it is being in the moment, being mindful, and being right here, right now, and I think that what we're going and being open, as Rachel said, to the suchness of life, that the Zen masters talk about the suchness of life. What is really extraordinary and about to happen is that through the work of Space for Humanity and other organizations, something new is going to happen, which is we're going to have people go into orbit or suborbital flight who are there for the experience. If you're a NASA astronaut, you're hired to do a job of work. If you happen to become enlightened as a NASA astronaut, that's just great, but that isn't why you're hired. Whereas I've started talking to some of the people who are going to go on Virgin Galactic, and I know Rachel's talked to people who are interested in Space for Humanity. For the first time ever, these new astronauts, they have heard about the overview effect. They're going in order to have the experience, and they're going to, if they listen to Rachel and me, they're going to be quite open to it. And I can't wait to see what happens with them, because we're going to have a completely new sample of people who are taking a very, very different approach to what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually a really big part of our mission too, is training people so that they're ready for the experience. And like, for example, there's Virgin Galactic, which is Richard Branson's company. And you go up in a spaceship and it's really, really intense on the body. And then there's Blue Origin, which is Jeff Bezos's company, and you go up in a rocket, also really intense on the body. And then we just partnered up with the Space Perspective, which is a stratospheric balloon company. So much less intense on the body. But when you take that into consideration, the fact that you are going to be experiencing these forces, and this is like literally a very like potentially dangerous situation that like your body's going to be like, what the heck is happening to me? And then you're only up there for a few minutes. And so that people do need to be prepared to be able to take that in, because there's going to be lots of stuff going on with the body. So that's a big part of our conversation as well, is like is how we will be training people so that they can take in that experience in an effective way.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. We'll get into a little bit more of, I think, what can we do individually here on Earth as each of us, and what roads and threads and paths are available now. But what I am still a little curious about from this kind of spiritual conversation is how there's social change that actually happens here on Earth. And one of the most curious things to me was how when the Apollo mission, right before they came back into the atmosphere, they were asked to turn around the camera and actually take a picture of the Earth. And I think, as Rachel said, mainly it's been, scientists and more the people, the technicians that were just concerned about the spaceship and what's outside. But that shift of just awareness of that one photo basically inspired Earth Day. And so, I know, Frank, you're a little bit curious and aware of that. And also, Rachel, I'd love to hear about where you also see the entrepreneurial side and really where do you see that extrapolating into and rippling through our society.
Well, I would say one of the benefits of age is that you get to experience a lot of different situations on this little spaceship we're on. So the photo you're talking about, there were two photos for Apollo 8 that were profound. And it happened in 1968, which was a terrible year for planet Earth, and especially for the United States, where we had two assassinations, we had social unrest, we had a war going on that was unwinnable, and we were beginning to see it was unwinnable. And people were pretty much in despair. Apollo 8 was great because it wasn't planned. It was supposed to be an orbital mission. And at the last minute, NASA said, let's just go to the moon. They heard the Soviets were going to go. So being competitive, they decided to go. And that mission, I remember very directly when they turned the camera around, was really the first time the people of planet Earth had seen the whole Earth, It was a fairly blurry, not very good picture, but it was mind-blowing, and I remember seeing it. And then later, they were rounding the moon, and they shot the famous picture called Earthrise. What's interesting is the very first astronaut I interviewed for my book, Joe Allen, he said, for all the reasons pro and con for going to the moon, no one said we should do it to look back at the Earth. But that may be the most important reason. It's really amazing the unintended consequences of space travel. And the truth of the matter is, space travel changes our consciousness, both inner and outer. And it's slowly but surely seeping into the minds of space agencies and humanity as a whole that this is a transformational tool we have. Dylan Taylor, who founded Space for Humanity, talks about space as transformational. And yes, you're right. When somebody says, I don't know what we've gotten out of space travel. I mean, we've spent all this money in space. What have we gotten out of it? Well, first of all, none of it was spent in space. It was spent on the Earth. But secondly, there is no question Earth Day, a very big change in our environmental awareness, came from the Apollo missions and the imagery that was sent back to us. It's just the beginning, though. I mean, we're now going to enter an era where it's going to be even more impactful, I'm sure. Rachel, you're in charge of that part. You're gonna be putting people out there. So, what do you think?
Well, I have just, oh, you disabled screen sharing, dang it. I have slides, yeah, just specifically about this. Let's see, can I do it? Yeah.
You can do it now.
Okay. So just for those who don't know, for the non-space people or for the new space people, this is the Earthrise image. And so if you just imagine, like, these astronauts went around the moon and then they saw the Earth like it was a marble in the sky, like so small that you can cover it with your thumb. And can you just imagine like having that kind of experience? Everything from the Carl Sagan quote, everything you've ever known, the entire history of the human civilization is on this little marble that you can cover with your thumb in the sky. It's it's it is profound. And then, yeah, so just about it sparking the modern environmental movement. So that image was taken in December of 1968. And then within 3 years, the Environmental Protection Agency was founded, Earth Day was founded, Doctors Without Borders was founded, which without borders, that phrase didn't exist before we saw this image. A number of the leading organizations in the environmental movement were founded, and then a number of acts specifically to preserve our planet and preserve life on our planet were enacted as well. So this is really true and really important, and just points to the paradigm shift that it creates, and then also like the long-term thinking that is necessary that it creates as well. I was talking to a friend yesterday about how it's just hilarious, like the perspective that we take in our society. Like we put bodies in caskets and bury them, like thinking like that is just so not long-term thinking at all. You know, like if we were thinking long term, we would actually think about like how bodies decompose and what would be useful for like where we could put them and what would be useful. But we put them into freaking caskets and bury them in the ground and like lots that are becoming bigger than we actually need or can handle. And so that's another like really potent part about the overview effect, is it actually gives us the perspective to think long term and think in a sustainable way. And it's more than just about our environment. It's also about like ways that we can treat each other. It's about creating systems that are sustainable, that treat people fairly and give, and yeah, and all of it. It sheds light on so much of what we've built in our society was built from beliefs that are not around long-term thinking and around preserving our planet and helping each other. So much of it was just built on the foundation of wanting money and power. And so the overview effect is a way for us to reframe what our value system is. And then the optimist in me says, let's build a future that's founded on that.
I have goosebumps right now. Yeah, and what really just resonated with me the most, just the awareness that there's just such a thin layer of atmosphere that's holding this all in, and really the fragility of our existence. And that to me also allows for me to not get caught up in the day-to-day minutia of flight or fight and all these instinctual things and societal concerns. And really, I hope everybody takes a little bit of this awareness to heart, in a way that they can meditate with that concept of how can I still be engaged but not in the driver's seat. And that, as an avid meditator, that to me is really the most interesting perspective shift through meditation, is by switching from a place of overviewing just my own life and saying, ooh, this is really interesting, and actually being able to see the timeline. Of course, we're not going to get into quantum mechanics and physics and time relativity, but there is something to be said of patience and really letting things be as they are right now, because we can't see what the result of that truly is, because we don't have that that capacity. And so, yeah, just hope that everybody, especially, I know so many people are just really caught up in things, energetically, emotionally, all the stuff that's going on. I just hope that we can really empower ourselves to use these tools of our own awareness and perspective change to be catalysts for actually thriving and seeing opportunity through these times. And that's also what I'm seeing happen right now, is people actually saying, all right, I am an advocate for this earth. I'm an advocate for inclusivity. I mean, there's just so many ways we can unpack that conversation. But really what I'm now excited about is unpacking what we can actually do. What both your organizations, I know Frank mentioned the Human Space Program at the beginning. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, and also what Space for Humanity's doing, what content's out there, what ways can we actually continue this conversation on our own journey.
Well, I think, first of all, the Human Space Program, as I may have mentioned earlier, has gone from an idea to an organization, and we are in the early stages of putting that organization together. But ultimately, we're going to be looking to have opportunities for a lot of people to get involved. One of our major interests is how do we create a sustainable, inclusive, and ethical blueprint for the solar system, or the solar ecosystem, as we like to say. And the Earth is part of the solar system. So we're not talking about leaving the Earth. We're talking about Earth and the other planets. We're going to have at least 16 different task forces tackling the big ethical issues that are going to confront humanity as we expand our presence in the solar system. So that's definitely along the way that people can get involved. The other thing that you and I talked about earlier is that there is on the way to being a reality, and Mary Liz Bender is pushing or creating this, I should say, something we're currently calling Overview Collective. And that is going to be a network of networks where people can get involved. They can have their own place within the network, interact with other people within it. And that's something that will be available in the very near future. Beyond that, in more immediate times, there is the Institute of Noetic Sciences. I would urge people to take a look at that. Of course, Space for Humanity, we've been talking about. The Overview Institute is another organization which is working on bringing the overview effect down to Earth. And so there are many different organizations out there that are beginning to work on these issues. And I would say people should look for opportunities where they can get involved, because there are things that we can do now. And I think Rachel said she would send you a list of virtual reality projects that are ongoing. And this is another entirely different opportunity to have the experience without getting on a rocket and without spending the money that's going to be involved in doing that. So there are going to be quite a few opportunities, and there already are quite a few at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, Frank covered a lot of it. I would definitely say go watch the overview film. It's free online in 20 minutes and just incredibly awe-inspiring. And then Mary Liz Bender, she's one step ahead of me, and she posted, we have a webinar series, Space for Humanity does, and we've had some really incredible conversations with our founder, who is single-handedly making a difference in what our future in space will look like. And then we also, we've hosted different events that are on there. We have a resources page, and then we're also going to be launching an overview sessions. So it'll be a talk series where maybe we'll talk about space, and maybe we'll talk about totally different other topics. And what we plan on doing is bringing on experts in different fields, people who are addressing different global challenges. And then by having myself or Frank or someone else interview them and really zooming out to that overview perspective, then we can all start to train our brains to think about these problems from that planetary perspective. And so that's the goal from this content, is that like by immersing yourself in this content, you will train yourself to be thinking from the largest system that we are a part of, other than everything beyond it. But you know what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, and I love what Mary Liz is working on, the Overview Collective. I mean, that is, I think, very, near and dear to where Find My Zen is trying to act. We're not trying to be the source of, oh, we have all the information. We're just really looking to be the connector, because so many people are building these amazing things, and how do we really become that interconnected component so that people can get curious and say, oh, I've heard something about that modality, that practice. Where is that in my own local area that I can actually, go experience it? Because I think really experience things, experiential learning is just such a potent component to our understanding on a somatic level. And then I also really get curious about the video itself and how that's been a tool by just sharing this content and sharing these things. I don't know how many millions of views the Overview Effect has gotten on YouTube, but I know it's way up there. Frank, where is it at right now? 8 million?
Million
Yeah.
on Vimeo. Yeah.
Yeah, on Vimeo. Yeah, so go watch that. Share this, because again, if people, it's a trust network, and when somebody sees you share it versus just something that's an advertisement or something, it brings it back to home. It brings it back to a connectedness that it's actually a conversational piece that obviously knowing Rachel, this has just blown up into so many other, possibilities even for Find My Zen, just because of that curiosity of a conversation that was had. So I really encourage everybody to get curious by not only investigating ourselves, but also sharing with other people that you think might be interested as well, because that really is where we can make impact right now. And that is the ripple effect that I think we really all want to be a part of. I do want to open it up to any questions. Feel free to just post something in the chat, or I'm happy to let somebody come on and actually speak as well. But I just want to see if there's anything that's just burning inside right now for any of the audience members. Otherwise, we will be wrapping it up soon. Frank, I also love just that you're sharing so much about not just the stuff that you've been doing, as well as Rachel with Space for Humanity, IONS, such a great organization that just is reaching into not just this conversation, so many other components of our conscious exploration. So just want to give a shout out to them. So much of this we will put into a follow-up email. So if there are things, feel free to reach out to me directly. I will pass along any specific questions from here to keep that conversation going. But we have a question from Joy. Kids are already curious and in awe. How are they participating in these programs?
Go
Frank,
ahead.
do you take this one or should I?
Go ahead. Yeah, I got a couple of thoughts, but go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So, well, for Space for Humanity, you do have to be 18 or older to fly. That's a agreement with the flight providers as of now. Maybe it'll change in 5-10 years, but right now it's 18 and older. And then, well, our educational content is available to anyone. And there's also a lot of different space education organizations for kids specifically. So yeah, Joy, I would have to know what your kids are interested in, but like there's programs that you can like build something to send up to the International Space Station. You can build an experiment to send up there, and then they'll like the astronauts up there will like do an experiment for you in zero gravity. And then there's also there's this thing called Zero Gravity Corporation. They do parabolic flights with airplanes. So basically you go up, and then every time you go down, it's like you're experiencing weightlessness. And you can do experiments on there as well. And you can also purchase spots on there if that's something that you're interested in. What else is there? I mean, I would have to know what your kids are interested in, Joy, but there's a lot out there. And I would also say like they can watch the overview film, they can watch Cosmos, like just start sharing space with them. Like, yeah, get them trained early and have them all understand that we all live on a planet together.
Yeah, a couple of things I would add to that. There's NASA recently, I was invited down to Johnson Space Center last year. I interviewed several astronauts and we videotaped it. And that's now become the basis of a series called Down to Earth. And if you go to YouTube and just search for Down to Earth NASA, you'll find these 3-minute astronaut commentaries that I think kids could really get into. It's very simple, very direct, and it's about their experience. And then Michael put a link in the chat to Space Buzz. And Space Buzz was created in the Netherlands. They've built this huge bus that looks like a spaceship, and they're driving around all over the Netherlands to schools. And the kids go on board, they put on virtual reality goggles, and they go into orbit. And it's narrated by a Dutch astronaut. They would like to expand to the United States. And, if you're interested, you might want to check out what they're doing and maybe get involved in helping them bring it here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm also going to put a link in the notes. This website, Look Up One Sky, and I love just when you go on there, no one shows a child the sky. It's an African proverb, and to me that just obviously goes back to this. This is such an innate part of our humanity, to get curious and to be explorative. So I'm going to put that in the comments right now. There's that website. And then there was one of...
That was founded by Mae Jemison, who was the first woman of color to go to space.
Mm.
Correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, just so beautiful. I just even love, as we all know, people on the International Space Station, how, your nationality and everything else falls to the wayside because you're there for one common mission. You're there as humans. And I just, to me, that just continues to be such a, I think, template that we can utilize in today's environment. So I just really want to honor that. And I also want to honor, Frank mentioned, not just looking at it from like our perspective of space and, our relativity as Earth and what we're all a part of. What's going on the other side? What happens when we actually turn and look at the rest of the solar system? And so how do we, not just Earth gaze, but how do we actually then go above and beyond just, gazing at the sky and the moon? What else is out there? And really, that can be another conversation down the line. But that to me is just something that really tickles my fancy in that way of just, I could sit with that and just go down many different channels of just getting excited and actually understanding my own self through that journey of exploration. So one other question that Mindy asked is, how do we explain the overview effect in a way that children can understand? How would you explain a cognitive shift? Is there any kind of languaging that could be used for that?
It's a very, very good question. I suppose it depends on the age of the child. But basically, I wouldn't use the term cognitive shift. I would say something more like the astronauts see the Earth in a new way. They see it in a different way. And I would, we haven't talked about this much, but the classic insight of the astronauts is no borders or boundaries. I would say they don't see, like, have you ever looked at a globe? It's got little colored, it's got little lines, and in the lines are colored areas called countries. The astronauts don't see that, they don't see it at all. And I guess the other thing I would say, and this is very current with the pandemic and the other things that are going on the Earth right now, I would say the astronauts tell me we're all in this together. And maybe you've heard a lot of people saying that recently. And what it means is all human beings on this planet, our future is linked together. We have to be kind to each other. We have to work with each other. And it's not just the humans, it's the animals. It's the whales, it's the porpoises, you know, it's all of life. Everything on this planet is very precious because you know what? We haven't found any other planet with living things yet. So we really, really have to take care of uh, our Earth and all the people on it and all the animals and all the plants. I guess that's what I would say.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not an expert on talking to children, but that's what I thought.
I'm not either. So, but that was great, Frank. Honestly, I don't have much to add.
Well,
Other than, I guess I would ask, has this child ever had an experience that totally changed their life? You know, and like some people get it from going to like traveling, going to other countries or seeing landscapes or something like that, like something that just shows them that the world is bigger than what they thought.
Yeah.
And so when astronauts go to space and have this experience, it's like that times a lot.
Could I just add, Michael, I know we're running out of time, but Mindy, my first major address on space exploration was to my son Josh's daycare class. And I talked all about living in outer space, living on the moon, living on Mars. And at the end, I said, how many of you would like to live in space? Everybody raised their hand except one child named Masaki. And he said, but Mr. White, we are in space. And of course, that's how I opened my conversation here, is realizing this fundamental truth that we're already there. And so in many cases, 4-year-olds get it even more quickly than the rest of us, mature adults.
yeah, that's I love Guy in the comments said, I bet kids can provide an amazing definition themselves. So not to actually get too in our heads about trying to express it. Actually, let's ask the kids and get curious with them because there's a lot to learn from that conversation as well. Yeah, well, in honoring everybody's time, we are at 11:59. So thank you so much for everybody participating today and joining this conversation. I hope that there was some insights and some maybe some little shifts internally of just like your own awareness of what's going on. I will definitely follow up with some more material and threads for you to continue to go deeper. And yeah, thank you. Really very grateful for you, Frank and Rachel, for taking the time today. I know this is really meaningful, and I ask that everybody else in the audience just gets a little more curious and shares something to somebody else that they care about today. And so somebody asks what happened today and what did you get into? I hope that this is something that you bring into that conversation. So thank you, everybody, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Bye, everybody. Thanks,
Bye, everyone.
Rachel. Thanks, Michael.
Mm-hmm.